Hello, and welcome to this presentation for classical Chinese philosophy on the topic of ancient Chinese history. In this program, we will do the following. We will get introduced to two ancient sources of Chinese history. Using those sources, we will learn about the five emperors. We will examine the history of the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties. And finally, we will get introduced to a few philosophical concepts. The concepts of the sage kings, heaven, and the mandate of heaven. History has always been somewhat more important to Chinese philosophy than it has been to Western philosophy. And this is reflected in the teachings of the philosopher Confucius. Confucius in the Analects in Book 2, Chapter 11, is recorded like this. The master said, "A true teacher is one who, keeping the past alive, is also able to understand the present." And then at Book 7, Chapter 1, he says, "The master said, I transmit rather than innovate. I trust in and have love for antiquity. I might thus humbly compare myself to old Peng." Confucius then seems to think that it is crucial to his philosophical project to know something about the historical past. And that, in fact, is a common theme in Chinese philosophy. And so in order to have a full understanding of Chinese philosophy, we need to know something about Chinese history. Our examination into Chinese history will take us into the misty path of mythology and legend, the time before the establishment of the first three Chinese dynasties. We will first examine the time period of the five emperors. We will begin the study by taking a look at an important early contributor to Chinese philosophy. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that we will do in this presentation is learn of two ancient sources. And here's the first that we will consider. And that is from the work of Sima Qian, who lived during the Han Dynasty, and his years are something like 145 or 135 to 86 BCE. If you're not familiar with the BCE connotation, it means before the contemporary era. And his book is called The Record of the Grand Historian, which is his compilation based on some preliminary work that had been done by his father, Sima Tan. And in Chinese it is the Shiji. And you can take a look at a copy of this at a website that is called the Chinese Text Project. And the Shiji is available on this website at this URL. So here is a description that we get from our own book, the RCCP, which is Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, about the historian Sima Qian. Sima Qian dates 145 to 90 BCE or something like that. A Han Dynasty, see important periods figure, who completed the Shiji, Records of the Historian, a work begun by his father Sima Tan. The Shiji is the first comprehensive account of Chinese history from its beginnings to the time of composition. It had a tremendous influence on later Chinese views of history and historiography, and was treasured as a fount of moral and political exemplars and insights, and that's from page 382. Sima Qian begins his history with this sentence. Huang Di, and Huang Di is the Yellow Emperor. Huang Di was a son of Xiao Dian and that is the place where the Yellow Emperor Huangdi is supposed to have come from. And so we know that Sima Qian is going, although there could be history prior to the Yellow Emperor, Sima Qian is going to begin his history with this fellow, who is the Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. And his traditional dates are either 2697 or 2698 to either 2597 or 2598 BCE. And notice how long the time period is of ancient Chinese history. This is a very long time ago. This is 4,500 years or so ago that we are looking into the past at what is purported to be an existing political and social civilization. According to Sima Qian, Huangdi did the following. He consolidated a failing feudal system. He instituted the first components of the Chinese bureaucracy, and we should pause for a moment and think about what an important contribution the Chinese have made with respect to the innovation of bureaucratic measures for ruling large, very large states. He invented a calendar. Now we'll see also that there is another of the sage kings that we'll be talking about who is also credited with inventing a calendar. And keep in mind that the Chinese have been very interested in keeping track of time for, well, it looks like 4,500 years, at least from the legendary history. Now, the second of these calendars is going to be pretty accurate. It's going to have a year be 366 days, and then it will have an intercalary day to make up for the problems that arise from being just slightly off from our modern calculations. He also made is supposed to have made significant innovations in grain production. That is, he is supposed to have introduced the growing of the 5 grains, and also he made significant innovations with respect to the domestication of animals. Now, when the Yellow Emperor died, and you can see that he lived for a very long time, he is purported to have lived 100 years. When he died, Huangdi's grandson, Zhuan became the next emperor. And he is supposed to have reigned from 2514 to 2436 BCE. And Sima Qian does not have a lot to say about Zhuan, but he does say that he modeled himself on heaven. Now that is something that we should keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about this philosophical concept of heaven as we go forward. After Zhuan died, Huangdi's grandson Ku became the emperor, and again, Sima Qian just doesn't have very much to say about Ku. But he does say that he sought to cultivate himself. And we'll hear that frequently. In fact, that is one of the themes of classical Chinese philosophy, and that is the cultivation of personal character or virtue. After the death of Ku, his son Ji followed him to the throne. Sima Qian's only pithy remark about Ji is this: Ji reigned in his father's stead. Ji reigned badly and died. No image of Ji seems to have been made, so we'll keep that side blank. He is not considered to be one of the 5 emperors, although it is true that he ruled for 9 years. He was considered by Sima Qian to be unworthy. Now, after Ji died, his younger half-brother Yao took his place on the throne. and Yao is revered as one of the greatest kings of antiquity. In order to say something about Yao, it's important that we take a look at the second source of Chinese history. It is with the Emperor Yao that classical historiography begins. The Book of History, or the Book of Documents, the Shang or the Xijing, that should be the Shujing, sorry. The Xijing, by the way, is the book of poetry. Sorry about that mistake. The Shujing begins its record with the Emperor Yao. The Shangshu is one of the so-called 5 classics of ancient China. The other 4 classics are the Book of Odes, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Each of these texts is described in the important text section at the back of our RCCP text. 4 of the 5 classics are available in English translation at the Chinese Text Project. The one that is missing from having an English translation is the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is a different style of book and is very difficult. There are English translations available, but they're somewhat difficult to run down. And the historical style of the Spring and Autumn Annals is almost exclusive to people who know a little bit more about the history than what we might have to begin with. It's important then, if you're going to read the Spring and Autumn Annals, that you have a commentary to go along with you. The 4 texts that are available in English are available at the Chinese Text Project at this site. Here is the description of the Shangshu from our RCCP text. The history, the Shu or the Shangshu, the original text purportedly contained the pronouncements and judgments of important figures at critical junctures in history, along with the odes, which is the Xijing. The Shujing was regarded as a classic from the very earliest period. Both were seen as repositories of traditional wisdom and cited as support by a wide range of Chinese thinkers. The present version of the text contains some genuine Zhou Dynasty, see important periods, era writings, though its purportedly pre-Zhou material remains suspect, and that's from the RCCP text, page 387. This text is available at this site. The first words of the Shangshu are, Yao, who is the king that we were just introduced to, Yao was reverential, intelligent, accomplished, and thoughtful. Naturally and without effort, he was sincerely courteous and capable of all complacence. The bright influence of these qualities was felt through the 4 quarters of the land and reached to heaven above and earth beneath. He made the able and virtuous distinguished, and thence proceeded to the love of all in the 9 classes of his kindred, who thus became harmonious. He also regulated and polished the people of his domain, who all became brightly intelligent. Finally, he united and harmonized the myriad states, and so the black-haired people were transformed. The result was universal concord. And this is what Sima Qian has to say. He is equally as laudatory of the Emperor Yao. Yao's benevolence was that of heaven. His intelligence was that of spirits. Drawing near to him, he was like the sun. Gazing on him from afar, he was like the clouds. Confucius, too, is going to have some remarkable things to say about the Emperor Yao. Recall that the reason that we are interested in the first place in Chinese history here is because of its relation to Chinese philosophy. And in Confucius, we see this popping up with respect to the Emperor Yao. Here's what Confucius has to say about Yao. The master said, How great was Yao, as a ruler, so majestic. It is heaven that is great, and it was Yao who modeled himself upon it, so vast. Among the common people there were none who were able to find words to describe him. How majestic in his accomplishments, and how glorious in cultural splendor. That comes from Analects, Book 8, Chapter 19. There's also a description of Yao in the back of our RCCP text, under the important figures section. And this is what it says. Yao, Emperor Yao, first of the mythical three sage kings. Now, we're not considering three sage kings. We're actually going with a different categorization. That is the categorization of the five emperors. These five emperors have a subset of these three mythical sage kings. So Yao is the first of these. See Shun and Yu below. His traditional reign dates are 2356 to 2255 BCE. He is credited with the invention of the calendar. I mentioned before that another king besides Huang Di is also credited with the invention of the calendar, and that's King Yao. And like I said before, his calendar is a calendar of 366 days. He is also credited with developing rituals, music, and establishing the basic structure of government. Yao skipped over his own unworthy son and designated a peasant named Shun as his successor, based upon the latter's remarkable filial piety. Yao is said to have trained Shun to rule and shared power with him during the last 28 years of his reign, from pages 382 to 383. In this passage, we have our first mention of the concept of a sage king. Sage kings are thought to have given humanity many different gifts. They are thought to have given humanity government, agriculture, writing, religion, etc. What we just now saw is that the sage king Yao gave humanity an accurate calendar, and that's crucial for regulating agriculture. And also music. We'll see very frequently reference made to the invention and the development of music by the sage kings. And ritual. Ritual is one of the most important concepts for the Confucian philosophers that we will be looking at. And it is thought that these sage kings deliver to us the critical rituals. The idea of a sage king is important for all of the philosophers that we will be studying. As was mentioned, Yao co-ruled with the chosen successor whom he trained, and that was Shun. Like Yao, Shun too is noted as a great sage king. He is particularly noted as a great exemplar of the virtue of filial piety. Here is the RCCP description of Shun. Shun, Emperor Shun. Second of the three sage kings, see Yao and Yu below. His traditional reign dates are 2255 to 2205 BCE. Renowned for his filial piety, Shun's own father, known as the Blind Man, and stepmother treated him remarkably badly and even attempted to kill him on several occasions in order to benefit his spoiled and generally worthless half-brother. Shun continued love and respectfulness in the face of this abuse, and eventually, I misread that. Shun's continued love and respectfulness in the face of this abuse eventually won over his parents and brother, moving them to reform. Now, it didn't win them over for a long time. It turns out that even after Shun was sitting on the throne and co-ruling with Yao, his half-brother and his father tried once again 2 more times to kill him. On one occasion, They sent him to the top of a grain elevator, and while he was at the top of the grain elevator, they set the thing on fire with the expectation that he would either have to jump and perish or he would perish in the fire. But Shun, incredibly, and this is really very interesting for this very old record, Shun used two conical Chinese hats as parachutes and jumped down from the top of the tower and thus saved himself. And on another occasion, they asked him still one more time to dig a well. Now, he knew that what their character was like, and so before he even began digging the well proper, he dug an escape route. So as he is digging this well, what happens is the stepbrother and his father, or the half-brother and his father, come and begin throwing dirt in on him in the bottom of this well. And of course, there's going to be no escape for him if it weren't for the fact that he had dug an escape prior to beginning to dig the well itself. This is what Sima Chen has to say about Shun. He has something very interesting to say here. Recall from the RCCP passage above that Shun was chosen as successor by Yao and that they co-ruled until the death of Yao. After the death of Yao, Shun yielded his position as the emperor to Yao's son and moved to a territory outside of the kingdom. But something very interesting began to happen. Instead of reporting to Yao's son as emperor, all the ministers of government and the people who needed lawsuits resolved, and the people themselves came to Shun in his exile. Shun said, "This must be the will of heaven," and he resumed the office of emperor. Shun recognized in the actions of the people that their hearts inclined toward him as their ruler rather than toward Yao's son. Shun said, "Oh, this looks like a repeat. This must be the will of heaven." Shun recognized the inclination of the hearts of the people. So let's see what we have next. The people willfully submitting to the rule of a leader is indicative that that leader has been selected to rule by heaven. This is referred to as the mandate of heaven. And it is the way by which people under ancient Chinese ideas about government give their consent to be governed. You can decide if this is a form of democracy. For those of you who have had exposure to political theory, consider this in conjunction with John Locke's idea that a government must rule with the consent of the people in order to be legitimate. The Shangshu says the following about Shun. Examining into antiquity, we find the Emperor Shun. His character was entirely conformed to that of the former sovereign. He was profound, wise, and accomplished and intelligent. He was mild and courteous and truly sincere. The report of his mysterious virtue was heard on high, and he was appointed to occupy the imperial seat. Shun carefully set forth the 5 cardinal duties, and they became universally observed. In this passage, there are a couple of things to think about. First of all, he was observed from on high. Now that certainly means that Yao observed him. But there is the connotation that this is heaven that is observing Shun and is choosing him because of what it says here, his mysterious virtue, as the future leader. The second thing to observe here is this business of the 5 cardinal duties. We will have later occasion to speak of these duties and the 5 relations that they attend. This becomes an important part of classical Chinese normative philosophy. As with Yu before him, Shun chooses from among his worthy subjects a successor to co-rule with him. As with Yu before him, Shun does not choose his own sons. And in not choosing his own sons, he does not establish any dynasty. He chooses, that should say Yu. He chooses Yu, and they rule together for 30 years. Both of those should say Yu. When Shun dies, Yu becomes the next emperor. Yu is the last of the 5 emperors. So in the category system that we have been looking at here, in terms of the 5 emperors, he's the last. In terms of the 3 sage kings mentioned by RCCP, he is also the last of the 3 sage kings. But it's important to realize that he is also the first king of the Xia Dynasty. And there he is. This is from Analects 8, Book 8, Chapter 21, 8.21. Of Yu, Confucius says, "The master said, with Yu I can find no fault. He ate the meanest bear while making offerings to ancestral spirits and gods with the utmost devotion proper to a descendant. He wore coarse clothes while sparing no splendor in his robes and caps on sacrificial occasions. He lived in lowly dwellings while devoting all his energy to the building of irrigation canals. With Yu I can find no fault." Yu is credited with bringing an end to the floods that had plagued the ancient people of China. In this, he is in the position of a Chinese Noah. That is, he is the personality who is in play in the Chinese version of the universal flood story. In China, though, the universal flood was managed not by floating away from it, but by digging irrigation canals to drain off the floodwaters. Unlike Yao and Shun before him, Yu chooses his own son to rule after him. And thus, he establishes the first hereditary dynasty. That is, the Xia Dynasty. And here's what our text, the RCCP, has to say about the Xia Dynasty. Xia Dynasty, traditional dates 2205 to 1766 BCE. See Yu and Jia under important figures. Here, in this map, you can see the area that is occupied in China. The outline of the very white material is present-day China. And you can see what a small area the first Chinese dynasty occupied. Notice that it is completely inland, that it does not have any access to the sea. Until quite recently, it was assumed that the Xia Dynasty was purely mythological. In part, this was due to a lack of archaeological evidence about the Xia Dynasty. The Xia Dynasty is supposed to have existed at a time that we think of as the end of the Stone Ages, the Neolithic period. But in addition to the lack of archaeological evidence, there was also a movement among 20th century Chinese scholars. This was probably in some ways influenced by Western philosophies. And this movement is the doubt history movement, or the skeptical movement, which suspects that the old texts are not revealing to us genuine history, but they are revealing to us just myths and legends. Contemporary archaeological findings, however, have showed that the Xia Dynasty is in fact, that there was corroborating evidence of something going on in the area where the Xia was supposed to have been in that time frame. And it wasn't purely a Neolithic culture. What we have here is a Bronze Age, an early Bronze Age civilization with a capital city. However, the Xia apparently did not yet have writing, and so that is a big detriment in our coming to understand much about the Xia. The Xia dynasty is said to have had 17 kings from Yu to the last king, the tyrant Xia. Sima Qian says of Xia, he did not engage in virtuous government, but in military power, and this hurt the families of the 100 Names. The families of the 100 Names were not able to bear him. Of course, what that means is that Xia had failed to live up to his obligation that he receives as the emperor with the mandate of heaven. Xia has lost the mandate of heaven inasmuch as he has lost apparently the consent of ordinary people. Sima Qian says that someone was already in the wings and had the support of the people. Here's how the RCCP portrays Xia. Xia, tyrant Xia. Purportedly the evil last ruler of the Xia dynasty. His traditional dates are 1818 to 1766 BCE. And who was waiting in the wings? Xia had already had Tong arrested, but he let him go. Sima Qian says Tong cultivated virtue and the princes all went over to him. So Tong led an army to attack Xia of Xia. And what this seems to indicate is that the consent of the governed had transferred from the sitting emperor, this tyrant Xia, to one of the nobles, namely this fellow Tong. And he is going to lead an army then. And when he leads an army, he really thinks he is acting on heaven's command to overthrow this evil sitting emperor. Tong the Successful established himself as the emperor and founded the Shang Dynasty. Here's what the RCCP has to say about Tong. Tong, King Tong, also known as Tong the Successful. His traditional dates are 1766 to 1753 BCE. He defeated the tyrant Xia, see above, and founded the Shang Dynasty. And here is a map of the Shang Dynasty, and you can see the Shang has extended the territory of the old Xia Dynasty. And now these people who are essentially land people, land lubbers from the central plain of China have extended their empire so that it has reached the sea. Here's a description of the Shang from the RCCP. Shang Dynasty, also known as the Yin Dynasty. Traditional dates are 1766 to 1122 BCE. See Tong and Zhou under important figures. The Shang brought with them a tribal god called Shang Di, the Lord on high. This god will have an effect on the concept of heaven to be developed, and so we'll have to keep that in mind. The Shang king held an important religious and ceremonial position in Shang society. The king performed a daily act of divination. To perform this ritual, ox bones and tortoise shells, oracle bones, were engraved with characters. And then, after the the bone had been engraved, these oracle bones had been engraved. Red hot pins were placed in the bone itself that caused fractures. And as the fractures moved toward these various characters that had been engraved, there was a sense of what was going to happen in the future. These engravings are the oldest extant Chinese writing artifacts that we have. The Shang also, though, excelled in bronze wares. They would make earthenware molds, just one mold, and then they would pour molten bronze into these molds and then break them out to have these wonderful bronze pieces, many of which are very, very heavy and quite sophisticated in design. They inscribed these vessels also with characters that are the etymological ancestors of today's Chinese characters. We know quite a bit about the Shang these days because of quite recent archaeological finds. The oracle bones were not recognized as having writing on them. They were being ground up for Chinese medicine until 1899. During the 20th century, there was a good deal of archaeology into ancient China. And one of the things that happened in the 20th century is that we actually found the Shang capital of Anyang. And it has, since that time, been thoroughly excavated. 11 royal tombs have been excavated at Anyang, and interestingly, these tombs lend really impressive support to the accuracy of the ancient historical sources that we've been looking at. That is, the writings of Sima Qian and the ancient documents book of the Shu Jing. These excavations also lend support to the claim that the later Shang fell into corruption. They reveal systematic human sacrifice. At the royal tombs, what we find is that when a king dies, all of his attendants are going to go to the underworld or into the grave with him. And so a great deal of many people are killed at the death of the king. All of his attendants are killed. And not just the people, the horses also. So we dig these things up, and what we find are these human skeletal remains in place with these buried chariots. And alongside them are buried horse carcasses. Sima Qian tells us of the last Shang king, Zhou, that his licentiousness worsened until it knew no limits. And of course, what that means is that the Shang had failed to live up to the requirement of virtue, and as such, they had lost the mandate of heaven. Here's what the RCCP tells us about this last Shang king, King Zhou. Zhou, Tyrant Zhou, the last evil ruler of the Shang Dynasty. His traditional dates are 1154 to 1122 BCE. See also the entry for Wen above. And here is King Wen. The confidence of the people under Shang turned to one of the nobles. That is this fellow Wen, who was the king of a feudal state. And that feudal state was named Zhou, which happens to be the same Romanization of a character that the king has. But keep in mind that these two Zhous are identified by different characters in Chinese. However, Wen believed that Zhou might be reformed. He refused to overthrow Zhou even when, as Confucius says, most of the kingdom had already turned toward him. Here's what the RCCP says about Wen. Wen, King Wen. And it's for those of you who are interested in Chinese characters, it's worth paying attention to this character for this king's name, and it will come up as a play on words later in Confucius. A virtuous vassal of tyrant Zhou. Now, I should stop just briefly and say something about the feudal system. Some historians balk at calling the system that is set up for ancient China a feudal system, but it seems to have the same kind of character. What we have is a central king, and this central king is the emperor. And then rather than ruling centrally, what he does is he sets up local rulers. So there is, under the last days of the Shang, there is the central emperor, and that is this fellow Zhou. And then there is a vassal state, a feudal state, and it's ruled by King Wen. And back to the reading here. It says, his name means cultured. That character there is the character for writing for culture. King Wen ruled over a state called Zhou. Note that the name of this state, though Romanized the same way as the name of the tyrant Zhou, see above, is written with a different graph. While having a good warrant for rebellion, King Wen remained loyal to his ruler, sustained by the hope of reforming him. But that's not the case with his son. His son, when Wen dies, his son King Wu becomes the king of Zhou. And he is not, he doesn't feel any problem with rebelling against the wicked King Zhou, as Tong had with respect to Xia at the end of the Xia Dynasty. He feels like it is heaven's mandate that the king be overthrown. He overthrew King Zhou, slew the king, put his head on a pike, took the throne, and established the new Zhou Dynasty. He also made his father Wen the posthumous first emperor of Zhou. Here's what the RCCP has to say about King Wu. His traditional reign dates are 1122 to 1115 BCE. He is the son of King Wen, see above. His name means martial. That is, this character that is indicated there means something of warfare or martiality, quite different from the character for his father, who has the character for being cultured. After succeeding his father, he overthrew the tyrant Zhou, see below, and founded the Zhou Dynasty, see important periods, which was named after the state over which he ruled. So keep in mind that the Zhou Dynasty is named after this state where Wen and Wu were the kings. Now it becomes the central kingdom, and all the other outer kingdoms become vassals to this central power of the emperor. The establishment of the Zhou marked for Confucius and his followers the high point of Chinese moral cultivation. Analects 3.14 reports this. The master said, from the vantage point of the Zhou, one's gaze can encompass the two dynasties that preceded it. How brilliant in culture it was. I follow the Zhou. Unfortunately, King Wu survived in his new Zhou Empire for only a short time. When he died, his son Cheng was still too young to rule by himself. Of course, having a new regime in power and losing the ruler of that regime is a recipe for political disaster and instability. Fortunately, the Zhou Dynasty had another great virtuous leader in the brother of King Wu. This is the Duke of Zhou. The younger brother of Wu stepped in and acted as the regent to the young the young King Zheng until he was old enough to rule on his own. When Zheng did become of age, the Duke of Zhou actually did step aside and allow his nephew to ascend to the throne. For not usurping the throne when he very well could have, the Duke of Zhou has traditionally been regarded as a paragon of virtue. He is also thought to have had an important role in laying down Zhou ritual and in writing, editing, and organizing the 5 classics. For all of this, the Duke of Zhou is held up as a particular exemplar of virtue by Confucius. This is from Analects 7.5. The master said, "How seriously I have declined. It has been so long since I last dreamt of meeting the Duke of Zhou." The idea is that when we are living in accord with real virtue, we will be visited by the Duke of Zhou in our dreams, and we can think of ourselves as having, or at least Confucius thinks of himself as having fallen into corruption, or as varying from virtue in as measured by not having had a dream of the Duke of Zhou. Here's what the RCCP has to say about the Duke of Zhou. Zhou Gong, the Duke of Zhou, brother of King Wu. See above. According to the traditional accounts, when King Wu died, his infant son became ruler of the newly founded Zhou Dynasty. The Duke purportedly served the young king as a wise and virtuous regent and did not attempt to wrest power from him for his own gain. The Duke of Zhou served as a paragon for selfless devotion to the greater good. Now here you can see a map of the Zhou Dynasty. Immediately after having become the regent for Zheng, the Duke of Zhou faced rebellion by his elder brothers and also by remnant factions of the old Shang Dynasty. Keep in mind that the leaders of the former regime were still around. The Duke of Zhou was able to put down these rebellions and unify the empire. He was also able to expand the empire's border until ultimately the Zhou territory occupied the space that you see in the map above. Zhou Dynasty history splits into 2 main parts and 2 subdivisions, and each of these is important to know. At first, the Zhou established a capital in the western portion of the empire, and that period when the Zhou maintained this western capital is known as the Western Zhou. Eventually, the western capital, under pressure, had to be abandoned. The new capital was established in the eastern part of the empire, and the period under which the Zhou maintained the eastern capital is called the Eastern Zhou. The Eastern Zhou was a period of increasing disorder, and it subdivides into 2 parts. The first part is known as the Spring and Autumn period. During this time period, the Zhou kings were the nominal rulers of the empire, but the feudal vassals began seizing more sovereignty for the regional vassal states. That is, these outer kings are supposed to be subject to the central king of the empire. But more and more during this period of disorder, growing disorder in this spring and autumn period, these vassal kings are claiming for themselves to be, are claiming more and more sovereignty for themselves. We will see that Confucius is going to be very angry from time to time at the things that these vassal kings are usurping to themselves that properly belong to the central emperor. Ultimately, these vassal states became independent of Zhou's central oversight. The independent regional states, as they become independent and gain their own sovereignty, begin to engage in internecine war. And this period is known as the Warring States period. Now, our textbook has 7 philosophers in it, and Confucius belongs to the spring and autumn period. But the other philosophers, it's likely that all of the other philosophers, maybe not Lao Tzu to the extent that we have any confidence that there is any such singular person, maybe not Lao Tzu, but the other philosophers all belong to this Warring States period. The Warring States period, we might think, is the most productive of philosophy. Now, that may lead you to wonder, are the times when there is peace and prosperity and things are going well, are they really conducive to not having much creative activity? And those times when there is some upheaval and social chaos, are those more conducive to new forms of thought and action? The RCCP description of Zhou gives more detail about all of this history. And this segment of the RCCP is a rather long entry. Zhou Dynasty. Traditional dates for this dynasty are 1122 to 256 BCE, often divided into Eastern and Western Zhou. See below. Western Zhou. The earlier part, 1122 to 771 BCE, of the Zhou Dynasty, widely regarded as a golden age of peace and stability and prosperity. See Wen, Wu, and Zhou Gong under important figures. Next. The Eastern Zhou. I think that I have these maps mixed up. Eastern Zhou. The latter part, 770 to 256 BCE of the Zhou Dynasty, it began when disgruntled vassals together with barbarian, i.e. non-Chinese forces, sacked the Zhou capital and killed the ruling king. Remnants of the Zhou royal family escaped and founded a new capital far to the east at Luoyang and installed the king's son as ruler. However, the dynasty never again ruled China. That is, it never had complete control over the vassal states. They certainly did rule in the state of Zhou, or in a state that is recognized as Zhou, but they had eroding control over the vassal leaders. The spring and the autumn period. The period 722 to 481 BC, covered by the court chronicles of Lu, Kongzi, that is Confucius, Kongzi's native state. This period saw the rise of the institution of Ba, and that character is usually translated as something like hegemon. And what a hegemon is one of the vassal kings who is going to be helping the emperor out, so to speak. That is, he is going to be the power that supports the central emperor's position. Oh, so we've got this translated here as Lord Protector rather than hegemon. Recall that the Shang had worshipped a tribal god called Shang Di. The Zhou apparently brought with them into imperial power their own tribal god known as Tian. And they claimed that Tian was equivalent to Shang Di. Most people who read Chinese think of this character as representing the sky, and hence it is translated as heaven. That is how it is translated in our texts. In fact, here's what the RCCP has to say about the character. Tian. This term can refer to the sky, hence the standard translation heaven. However, heaven can also be a sort of power. Various thinkers think this higher power in different ways, though. Thus, heaven appears to be very much like a personal god in the Maoist writings, but is more like the impersonal processes of nature in Zhuangzi and Xunzi, and is somewhere in the middle in Kongzi and Mengzi. In the period covered in this anthology, heaven is not primarily thought of as a place and is not connected with any explicit views about an afterlife. The etymology of the character, however, strongly suggests, as you can see, and these pictures to the right are representations of the character Tian that are taken from bronze vessels and from oracle bones and early writings during the early Zhou Dynasty. And as you can see, they strongly suggest the pictograph of a person. This set of etymological characters is presented by being presented by the American sinologist Harley Krill. Here's what Krill says about the character. The etymology of Tian is very difficult to trace with certainty, but is probably as follows. Originally, this character was identical with Da, which originally signified an important man of rank and position. The greatest of such men were the kings. Da is part of the earliest form of Wang, king. But after their death, these kings became even more potent spirits, having almost limitless power over the destinies of their descendants and their subjects. As a group, these great ancestral spirits came to be thought of as presiding over destiny, and originally Tian denoted them. But since a Chinese character may be either singular or plural, Tian changed from a name denoting them as individuals to be a name for the group, and finally came to mean, as it does now, a rather impersonal, overruling supreme power. It also developed from meaning the ancestral spirits residing in the heavens to stand for the place in which they reside, i.e. the sky. This development that Krill notes must have taken place specifically among the Zhou people, for elsewhere he says that the Shang did not use the Tian character. When Zhou came to power, as Krill says elsewhere, they decreed that Tian was equivalent to Shang Di, the supreme god of the Shang. We will take it for granted that Tian probably signified at one time a personal god. During the time period that we are considering, however, this meaning evolved. It continued to evolve during the period of medieval Chinese philosophy to the point where it now simply seems to mean the sky. Keep in mind that this continues to be a controversial topic that modern scholars continue to investigate. And now you know everything that there is to know about classical Chinese history. Thank you.